What does it take to turn an emperor's skull into a drinking cup? Not just victory, not just hatred. It takes something more intimate than that. Something born in fire and humiliation, and the blood of children crushed beneath threshing stones. It takes the kind of rage that only comes when a man watches everything he has ever built reduced to ash by the very empire that was supposed to have left him in peace. In the summer of 811 AD, deep inside the Balkan Mountains, the most powerful army the Byzantine Empire had assembled in generations marched into a narrow mountain pass. They carried with them the plunder of a conquered capital, the arrogance of a victorious emperor, and the stink of atrocities that had made even their own chroniclers flinch. They believed the war was over. They believed the Bulgarians were finished. They believed they were going home. They were wrong. Within hours, in the pitch-black darkness before dawn, an entire imperial army would be ripped apart. An emperor would die in a ditch, and his skull would be scraped clean, lined with silver, and passed around a table of warriors as a toast to the dead. This is the story of how one man's arrogance built the perfect trap and walked straight into it. If stories like this are why you're here, the ones history tried to bury, then you're in the right place. Subscribe and stay. There's a reason we dig up what others leave behind. To understand what happened at Pliska, you have to understand what the Byzantine Empire had already lost, and how desperate it was to stop losing. By the early 9th century, the Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, was a kingdom of survivors. The Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries had torn away the richest provinces: Egypt, Syria, North Africa, the Holy Land. Two massive Arab sieges had hammered the walls of Constantinople itself. The empire had been forced inward, contracting like a wounded animal, pulling its limbs close to its body. And then, from the north, came the Bulgarians. They were originally a Turkic steppe people who had crossed the Danube in the late 7th century, defeated Emperor Constantine IV, and forced Byzantium to pay tribute. Over the next 100 years, they absorbed the Slavic tribes living in the Balkans, adopted their infantry tactics, and built a state that sprawled between the Danube and the Hemus Mountains, the Great Wall of Peaks known today as the Balkan Range. Byzantium paid them gold. Byzantium sent armies. Byzantium schemed, bribed, and betrayed. Nothing worked. The Bulgarians were not raiders passing through. They had come to stay. By the year 800, the Bulgarian frontier was barely a week's march from Constantinople. And then a new Khan rose to power. His name was Krum. Krum the Fearsome, the chronicles would later call him. And from the moment he took the throne, he changed the rules. Rather than raiding Thrace in the old pattern of border skirmishes, Krum attacked westward, destroying the remnants of the Avar Khaganate, absorbing their lands and doubling the size of Bulgaria in a few short years. In 807, his armies defeated the Byzantines in the Struma Valley. In 809, he personally besieged the strategic fortress of Serdica, modern Sofia, and when the garrison of 6,000 surrendered, he killed every last one of them. The message was unmistakable. This was not a man who wanted tribute. This was a man who wanted territory. And the man who sat on the throne in Constantinople, Emperor Nicephorus I, decided that this time there would be no negotiation, no gold, no treaty. This time, the Bulgarians would be crushed. They could not have been more different. Nicephorus I had never been a soldier. He was a finance minister, the logothetes tou Genikou, the empire's chief accountant, who had seized the throne in a palace coup in 802 by overthrowing the Empress Irene while Frankish ambassadors were still in the city negotiating a marriage alliance. He was a man of ledgers and taxes, not battlefields. His reforms were brutally effective. He taxed widows, he conscripted peasants, he resettled entire populations from Anatolia to the Balkans to shore up the frontier. Theophanes the Confessor, the Byzantine chronicler who despised him, numbered his impositions among the empire's great vexations. But Nicephorus was not stupid. He was an excellent organizer. He understood logistics. He knew that the empire's problem was not bravery. It was money, discipline, and the erosion of frontiers. What he lacked was the one thing no amount of administrative talent can replace: an instinct for war. Krum was made of something else entirely. His origins are obscure. Some historians have speculated he descended from the old Bulgar royal house, perhaps the line of the legendary Khan Krum. What is certain is that he was a man who understood power in its rawest form. He had conquered the Avars. He had built law codes that punished robbery, slander, and public drunkenness with terrifying severity. He could be diplomatic when diplomacy served him. The chroniclers record multiple occasions when he offered peace on generous terms. But when provoked, he was capable of the kind of violence that becomes legend. The Chronicle of 811, one of only two surviving accounts of what happened next, describes the campaign under a title that tells you everything. About the Emperor Nicephorus and how he leaves his bones in Bulgaria. Even the scribes knew how this story ended before they began to tell it. The geography of this disaster is everything. Between the flat Thracian plain to the south and the wide Moesian lowlands to the north rises the humus, the Balkan Mountains, a wall of forested peaks stretching 560 kilometers from Serbia to the Black Sea. For any army marching from Constantinople into Bulgaria, the humus was the barrier. The only way through was the passes, narrow, winding corridors hemmed in by steep slopes and dense forest, so thick that medieval writers called the region Magna Silva Bulgarica, the Great Bulgarian Forest. The Vărbitsa Pass, in the eastern section of the range, was one of these corridors. At 900 meters of elevation, it is not the highest pass, but it is narrow, twisting, and flanked on both sides by slopes choked with oak and beech. An army entering this pass is a serpent sliding into a bottle. The head moves forward, the body stretches, the tail disappears behind a bend. And if someone seals both ends of the bottle, the serpent dies. The Bulgarians knew this terrain like the contours of their own faces. They had been fighting in these mountains for more than a century. Their Slavic subjects, who made up the bulk of their infantry, had been practicing ambush warfare in exactly this kind of landscape for centuries before that. The Emperor Maurice, writing his military manual 200 years earlier, had warned, "They live like bandits and love to carry out attacks against their enemies in densely wooded, narrow and steep places. They make effective use of ambushes, sudden attacks, and raids." The Romans had read Maurice. They had studied the warnings, and in the summer of 811, they ignored every single one of them. The campaign began in May. Nicephorus assembled the largest army the empire had fielded in a generation. Troops from the Anatolian themes crossed the Bosporus and joined the European regiments in Thrace. The elite Tagmata, the Imperial Guard, marched at the heart of the column, the excubators, the Vigla, the Scolae, their armor gleaming. Nicephorus had also organized a new unit, the Hikanatoi, the worthies, composed of the teenage sons of the army's senior officers, commanded by his own son, Stauracius. It was meant to blood them, to bind their father's loyalty, to forge the next generation of commanders. It would become their grave. By July 10th, the army was encamped at the fortress of Marseilles, modern Karnobat, near the Bulgarian frontier. Nicephorus spent 10 days feinting, launching force attacks, pulling back, trying to confuse the enemy. Krum assessed the situation and saw the truth. This army was too large to fight on open ground. He sent envoys to offer peace. Nicephorus refused. The army crossed the mountains. The Bulgarians pulled back. Whether from fear or by design, the sources cannot agree. But Nicephorus divided his force into 3 columns, each taking a different route through the passes. Too many entry points for the Bulgarians to block. It was the one genuinely clever decision of the entire campaign. On July 20th, the Byzantines reached Pliska. The capital was defended by 12,000 elite Bulgar warriors. The Byzantines overwhelmed them. A second Bulgarian force, hastily assembled, larger but less disciplined, met them on the plains outside the city. The Byzantines defeated them too. By July 23rd, Nicephorus was sitting in Krum's own palace, drinking Krum's own wine, and dictating dispatches to Constantinople announcing total victory. And then the mask slipped. Michael the Syrian, a 12th century patriarch who preserved the account, described what happened next. His savagery went to such a point that he had their small children brought out, tied to the ground, and crushed with millstones. The Byzantine soldiers, unleashed by an emperor who had retreated to his tent and refused to see anyone, not even his own son, spread across the countryside in an orgy of destruction. They burned unharvested fields, they slaughtered livestock, they cut the tendons of living oxen and left them bellowing in the dirt. They raped, they looted. And when soldiers touched the plundered treasury that Nicephorus had reserved for himself, the emperor had their noses cut off. Krum sent one final embassy. The message was simple. Here you are, you have won, so take what you please and go with peace. Nicephorus sent the envoys away. He wanted more. He talked about marching to Serdica. He talked about building a city named after himself on the ruins of the Bulgarian capital. He had forgotten the mountains. He had forgotten the passes. He had forgotten that every atrocity his soldiers committed was being watched by a people who still had a Khan, still had warriors, and still had rage. Before we descend into what happens next, pause for a moment. If you're watching this from Bulgaria, from Greece, from somewhere in the Balkans where these mountains still stand, drop your country in the comments. History lives in the land. Let it know you're here. Krum had not been idle. While the Romans looted, he gathered what was left of his shattered forces. Surviving warriors who had fled into the forests, Avar mercenaries, Slavic tribesmen. Women, according to the Chronicle of 811, were given weapons and armor. Whether they actually fought in the ambush or were local Slavs defending themselves against marauding Byzantine soldiers, the point is the same. This was total mobilization. The entire Bulgarian nation was being called to war. And while his people assembled, Krum's engineers went to work in the mountain passes. They felled trees and bound them together with twine into crude but massive palisades. Walls of timber thrown across the narrow valleys. The Chronicle of 811 calls them a fearsome and impenetrable fence out of tree trunks in the manner of a wall. Behind the palisades, they dug deep trenches. This was not fortification, this was a killing corridor. A bottleneck designed to slow, channel, and destroy. The Bulgarians did not need to fight the Byzantine army. They needed to make the mountains fight for them. When scouts reported enemy activity to Nicephorus, the emperor panicked. The overconfidence evaporated in an instant. He abandoned his plan to march to Serdica and chose instead the shortest route back to Constantinople, directly through the Vărbitsa Pass. His cavalry rode ahead and returned with devastating news. The road was barred. Wooden walls sealed the exits. Bulgarian forces watched from the heights. Nicephorus said the words that every soldier in his army must have already been thinking. Theophanes recorded them. "Even if we had wings, we could not have escaped from peril." They were trapped. For 3 days, the Byzantine army sat in the pass. The emperor would not order an assault on the palisades. The generals argued. The arrows came. Bulgarian archers firing from the slopes into the packed, immobile column below. Morale disintegrated. Desertions began. And on the night of July 25th, the darkness came. There was no moon. The Chronicle of 811 describes what followed. "They fell on them, still half asleep, who arose and, arming themselves in haste, joined the battle. But since the forces were encamped a great distance from one another, they did not know immediately what was happening, for they fell only upon the imperial encampment, which they began to cut to pieces." Krum's forces struck the emperor's camp directly. The imperial guard, the excubators, the vigla, rose to fight, but the attack came from the darkness, from every direction, and the rest of the army, strung out along kilometers of mountain road, could not hear the screams, could not see the fires, could not reach the emperor in time. Those who could flee ran south. They hit the river. The chronicle continues. "They threw themselves into the river. Entering with their horses and not being able to get out, they sank into the swamp and were trampled by those coming from behind. And some men fell on the others, so that the river was so full with men and horses that the enemies crossed on top of them unharmed and pursued the rest." The Bulgarians crossed on a bridge of the dead. The survivors who made it past the river ran straight into the palisades. They abandoned their horses, climbed with hands and feet to the top, and found the trench on the other side. They fell. They broke their limbs. They lay in the dirt, unable to walk, and waited to die. Others set fire to the logs. When the bound timbers collapsed, the crowd surged forward and fell into the burning trench. Men, horses, and fire. The chronicle says the Hikanatoi, the teenage sons of the empire's finest officers, died here. Beautiful bodies that shined with whiteness, with golden hairs and beards, with handsome faces. Some of them had just been engaged to women, distinguished with nobility and beauty. All perished there. Nicephorus I died in the first assault. The Chronicle of 811 admits that nobody is able to relate the manner of his death. One account says he was found on a dunghill. The emperor, who had crushed children with millstones, ended his life in a pile of refuse, in the dark, in a country he had tried to erase. His son, Staurakius, survived. Barely. The imperial guard fought their way out, carrying the young man on their backs, while a sword wound to his spinal column slowly killed him. He would reach Constantinople, reign for 2 months from a stretcher, and die. Among the dead, The patricians Theodosios Salibaras and Sicinios Trifilios, the strategos of the Anatolics, the strategos of Thrace, the commanders of the excubators and the vigla, the flower of the empire's military leadership, wiped out in a single night. The army that had sacked Pliska simply ceased to exist. In the grey light of morning, the pass was something beyond a battlefield. Bodies choked the river, men and horses matted together in the mud, indistinguishable. The ditches behind the palisades were filled with broken, burned corpses stacked on top of each other. On the slopes, arrows still jutted from the earth like seedlings. The air smelled of blood and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of the dead before the sun has fully risen. Krum walked through it. He found the body of Nicephorus. He ordered the head severed and mounted on a stake. For days, Krum displayed it as the surrounding tribes came to witness. Theophanes recorded the rest. He bared the skull, riveted it on the outside with silver, and in his pride made the chieftains of the Sclavinians drink from it. A skull cup, lined with silver, passed hand to hand in a hall of warriors, wine swirling inside the cranium of the man who had tried to grind Bulgaria into dust. Whether this actually happened, whether it was historical fact or Byzantine literary convention borrowed from Herodotus's accounts of Scythian customs, has been debated by scholars for centuries. The historian John Wortley argued that Theophanes, knowing the Bulgarians lived beyond the Danube, may have applied ancient stereotypes of barbarian skull-drinking to Krum. But others, like Veselin Beshevliev, countered that the practice was real and documented among Bulgar culture, and that Theophanes, whatever his biases, was too careful a writer to invent details that would not have been believed by his readers. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but the image endures, and the image is the point. It was the ultimate humiliation. Not just defeat, not just death, transformation. The emperor's body became the enemy's trophy. His skull became a vessel for celebration. Everything he had been in life, the finance minister, the reformer, the conqueror of Pliska, was reduced to a cup. The news reached Constantinople like a funeral pyre. Staurakius was carried into the capital, paralyzed, and proclaimed emperor on a litter. He lasted 69 days before his brother-in-law, Michael I Rangabe, forced him aside. Staurakius died of his wound in January 812. Michael I proved no better. When Krum invaded Thrace the following year, Michael's army was routed at the Battle of Versinikia. He was the third Byzantine emperor dethroned in direct consequence of Krum's victories. Krum did not waste his triumph. Within a year of Pliska, Bulgarian forces were entrenched less than 150 miles from Constantinople. By 813, Krum stood before the walls of the capital itself, performing pagan rituals outside the gates, sacrificing animals and men in full view of the terrified population. The Emperor Leo V, Michael's successor, agreed to peace talks. When Krum arrived, Leo's agents tried to assassinate him. Krum escaped, wounded. His response was devastating. He stormed Adrianople, captured 10,000 prisoners, including the parents of the future Emperor Basil I, and began assembling siege equipment to take Constantinople itself. He died on April 13, 814, probably of a brain hemorrhage, in the midst of preparations for the final assault. His son Omotag made peace, but the damage was done. For 150 years, no Byzantine emperor dared send an army north of the Balkan Mountains. The Battle of Pliska was the last, best chance Byzantium had to destroy Bulgaria. Before Krum, the Bulgarian state was powerful but fragile. A Turkic military elite ruling over a Slavic peasant majority. The two peoples still distinct, still separate. After Pliska, the prestige of the Bulgarian Khanate soared. The Slavic tribes saw that this state could defeat the greatest empire in the Christian world. They integrated, they assimilated. 50 years later, Boris I accepted Christianity, and a common Bulgarian identity was born. A fusion of Bulgar military tradition and Slavic language and culture that would prove too deep-rooted for any conqueror to uproot. It took Byzantium until the year 1018, 2 full centuries after Pliska, before Basil II, the most methodical and relentless emperor in Byzantine history, finally conquered Bulgaria. But even Basil, who blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners and sent them stumbling home in columns of 99, could only destroy the state. He could not destroy the nation. The Bulgarians rose again in 1185 and established a second empire that endured until the Ottomans. The Battle of Pliska set all of this in motion. If Nicephorus had won, truly won, by holding the territory and incorporating it back into the imperial system, the Bulgarians might never have fused into a single people. The Balkans might have remained Byzantine. The endless wars that drained Constantinople's strength for centuries might never have happened. The long, slow bleeding that left the empire vulnerable to the Seljuk Turks, to the Crusaders, to the Ottomans, it all might have unfolded differently. But Nicephorus did not win. He burned a capital, slaughtered children, and walked into a pass in the dark. Today, the Vărbitsa Pass is quiet. The oaks have grown back over the trenches. The river runs clean. There are no markers for the thousands who drowned in the mud or broke their bodies on the far side of a wooden wall. But the Bulgarians remember. Every year on July 26th, reenactors in Bulgar armor gather near the pass. They carry curved sabers and horsehair banners. They build palisades from felled logs. And in the evening, when the light fades and the mountains turn blue, someone lifts a cup. The silver has long since corroded. The bone has turned to dust. But the gesture remains. A toast to a Khan who refused to be erased, and to an emperor who learned too late that the mountains have a memory longer than any empire. Some victories fade, some defeats become foundations, and some skulls, lined with silver, become the chalice from which an entire nation drinks its history. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the darkness of that pass, the weight of that silver-lined cup, then you already know there's more where this came from. The next video is waiting. Subscribe, hit the bell, and we'll meet again where the silence speaks loudest. See you there.